Welcome back to Analysis, where we've been discussing recent events in Palestine, namely the reconciliation agreement between Fatah and Hamas, as well as reactions from the international community. We've been joined now by Daniel Ben-Simon, a journalist and former Labour Party member of the Israeli Knesset, who's on the line from Jerusalem, and Dr. Dawood Abdullah, director of the Middle East Monitor. Welcome to you both. Let me begin, if I may, with you, Dr. Ben-Simon. I mean, the Israeli Prime Minister has said that this unity agreement has derailed the entire peace process. I mean, what is your view? Do you think that this could be a step forward, in as much as if you were ever to get an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, you'd probably want everybody in Palestine to be behind it, rather than one side saying it's a mistake?
Yes, I must say that the first reaction was very negative from the Prime Minister and from the cabinet members. Any talk with the Hamas is seen in Israel as something that cannot be done because of the Hamas view on Israel and on its future. But I think that the Israeli public will have to listen more about this reconciliation. And Abu Mazen has said repeatedly that if we get together, if there is reconciliation, Hamas will also abide by the agreement between the Fatah and Israel. So in a way, the Israelis need to hear more about it. And as I said, the first reaction from the Prime Minister was not a surprise. Everybody knows what Netanyahu thinks about the Hamas, about the Palestinian issue. So in a way, I would say that we need more time, and especially the Israelis need to hear more about what kind of Hamas we will get after the reconciliation.
Well, that's exactly the question that I want to put to Dr. Dawood Abdullah. I mean, what led to this agreement, and what is the substance of it in your view? It was a bit of a surprise and seemed to happen very quickly.
Well, to begin with, it's an internal Palestinian matter. It's a response to a national demand across the board within the West Bank and Gaza and the diaspora, that there should be a national unity, a movement that is capable of leading the national struggle rather than having a fragmented body with various poles of power and interest. So both parties were forced, as it were, by circumstances to respond to popular concerns and their own circumstances in the West Bank. Let's take, for example, you have a peace process that has been virtually going nowhere over the last 9 months. And in the case of Gaza, an international siege led by Israel, which requires urgent attention. It was believed that by unifying the efforts, both parties would be able to come to a common strategy, first to address the question of Palestinian statehood and rights in the occupied territories, and also the question of the siege on Gaza. This is the background.
But Daniel Ben-Simon, I mean, there are supposed to be elections after they've formed the government in 5 weeks' time. I mean, Israel has such huge power. Will it try and sabotage those elections and make them impossible to be held, do you think?
Well, I'm not a member of the government, and I cannot tell you, as I said, this is not an easy government. It's a right-wing government, and its position on the Hamas is well known. What I'm saying, and it's very important that the Palestinians send the message, as I know that this is an internal issue among Palestinians, but if you want Israelis to be more open to the reconciliations, statements have to be made as to the intentions of the Hamas later. Is it going to adopt the preconditions by the quartet? Is it going to be an Israeli partner to Israel? Is it going to recognize Israel? Is it going to be a part of any future plans in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians? So in a way, having one address is much better than having two. But as I said, after years of conflict between Israel and the Hamas, there is a need for more confidence-building measures, for more psychological peace before you get the Israelis to follow, as I said, this reconciliation.
But how do you get this psychological peace if the Israeli media is not discussing seriously and calmly what's going on among the Palestinians, rather than sort of denouncing it.
I would suggest, Israeli journalists cannot get into Gaza, but I would say, you have to find a way by maybe the Hamas, maybe Prime Minister Hania has to kind of invite maybe Israeli journalists to come and visit Gaza. Most of the people in Gaza speak Hebrew. They can understand, they can talk. You have to do some opening. They live 5 minutes from the Israeli cities in the south. So we're not talking about going to Iceland or going to Australia. We're talking about 5 minutes drive from Israel to Gaza. And maybe you need to show some sign of moderation, of willing to go along with the peace process. This Abu Mazen has done quite well. So what I'm saying is try to do something that will change the mind of Israelis and maybe talk beyond Mr. Netanyahu, because we all know exactly what he wants and what's his position on this. But what I'm saying, as an advice, I would say try, invite Israeli journalists, try to find a way to portray maybe a change within the Hamas. Israelis need to know about this, need to read about this, and need to see this kind of gesture.
Well, thank you for that. Martin Linton, how do you respond to that idea?
Well, I think it's absolutely essential to have more Israelis going to the West Bank and to Gaza, because outside every West Bank city there's a big red sign saying it's against Israeli law for Israelis to go into the city. And there's a deliberate policy by the Israelis of not allowing Israelis to meet Palestinians and not allowing most Palestinians to meet Israelis, which is, they're supposed to be neighbours, but they show absolutely zero neighbourliness. But I do also think that the issue of the reconciliation is becoming a bit of a red herring. Obviously, I very much welcome it, and it's a very, very important step forwards. But it's not actually. It's not impossible to have negotiations at the moment, because negotiations are the prerogative of the president, and Hamas accept that completely anyway. So that while it's very debilitating for the Palestinians to have this division, the most important thing that is happening is that the Israelis are continuing to build settlements. They're continuing to make the situation worse, and the resolution of that problem will not come from Ramallah or from Jerusalem. It'll come from European capitals, really. Are we prepared in our as Western countries to put the pressure on the Israelis that is required before they're prepared to sit down and make real concessions about, well, for a start, stopping building settlements; for another thing, talking seriously about the 1967 borders; for another thing, talking seriously about the economic stranglehold they have over the Palestinian economy; for another thing, joining the Gaza, allowing Gazans to come to the West Bank and West Bankers to go to Gaza. All of these are the real problems that are caused by the occupation and the embargo on Gaza. And the reconciliation, welcome as it is not the key event. The key event will be when the Israelis stop building settlements.
Dr. Dawood, let me go back, nevertheless, to the reconciliation agreement. Why should it work this time when there have been at least 2 other unity government announcements over the last few years, which then fizzled out? Why should we take this one more seriously?
I agree. It's a very good question, and it's quite pertinent. Simply because this current agreement signed in Gaza is really an affirmation of the previous 2 from Cairo and Doha. And what is required essentially is an implementation of those previous agreements. But the circumstances on the ground do not really favor the translation of these principles into reality. Take, for example, the issue of security cooperation with Israel. This essentially means, in practice, that the PA is obliged to pursue Hamas members in the West Bank. And even while the agreement was being signed, it coincided with the arrest of Hamas members, including senior figures. MPs were being detained while this agreement was being signed. So on that basis only, it seems rather, over-ambitious that this is going to succeed on this occasion.
Well, in a way, that point supports what Netanyahu said, but in a sort of from a different angle, that Fatah has to decide whether to have peace with Hamas or peace with Israel, and they've got to really be serious about getting unity genuinely, including with their security forces, surely, and then they can face Israel at the negotiating table in a much stronger position, don't they?
These are the limited options that Mahmoud Abbas has before him, and they are either carry on with a peace process with Israel under Kerry's initiative, which isn't going anywhere, or pull rabbits out of the hat like a reconciliation with Hamas, knowing how unhappy Israel is going to be about it, but being able to show the first real steps towards some form of Palestinian unity, which then, when peace talks do not succeed beyond a unity and an alliance and elections, all of which have their pitfalls, the Palestinians are then entitled to go to the United Nations on a united basis. It's not Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah and no voice coming out from Gaza. It's a united voice. And then you have to ask the international community whether it will approve of that voice and grant it status, and then go down a road of looking for a solution to this conflict, which would no longer be in Israel's hands. There are, however, Jonathan, as many pitfalls in that as there are in just creating a unity government, not least because I think at the moment the so-called civilized countries in the UN are very sceptical about what we're watching and are not ready to hand out a simple kosher stamp, if I may say so, of a Palestinian unity government. But give it time and see how it works.
But there is one sort of mystery or contradiction. I mean, if you're having a government of national unity and then elections, does that mean you suddenly collapse the unity and Fatah runs against Hamas? Or would there be unity government candidates against other people who we don't know who they would be as the opposition?
I think you need to ask Dr. Dawood Abdullah that question. We have our view in this country of how you run an election in a democratic process. I'm not sure how that's going to work in that context over there in Gaza, which Israel surrounds and controls, and over there in the West Bank, which Israel populates with settlers and controls with a very heavy hand. I don't know how it works.
Well, let me ask Dr. Dawood that point. I mean, these elections that are promised, do you see them as elections between Hamas running against Fatah to see which of them is more popular in both Gaza and the West Bank, or is it meant to be a government of national unity that puts up joint candidates against whoever wants to oppose them?
No, it's the former. It's two parties, two movements contesting for a popular vote. However, if you remember, in 2006, immediately after Hamas overwhelmingly won the elections, it did offer to form a national unity government. So one does not contradict the other. In fact, given the unique circumstances of the Palestinian situation, it would be wise to have a government of national unity. So let them contest the elections, as the accords outline, and after that, if they form a national unity government, that would be a bonus for whichever party wins. Indeed, for both.
And would you be confident that either party would accept being defeated by the other? Would they?
I think it's a long way before elections are held. In fact, the registrations have not been completed in Gaza. There are many obstacles. And the primary one, of course, is that of the security cooperation between Israel and the PA. What Hamas is saying is that our members, our activists, our people on the ground who can campaign for us are imprisoned. Our MPs are imprisoned. So how can we contest when we are not free to participate in the process?
I mean, some analysts have been suggesting that Hamas has come to this unity agreement from a real position of weakness because it's losing popularity in Gaza, because although the Israelis are responsible for the siege, Hamas is somehow blamed for the poor living conditions that arise from it. Then you've got the question of the border in Rafah between Gaza and Egypt being closed and the collapse of the Muslim Brotherhood. government in Cairo that was allied to Hamas. I mean, do you think Hamas is really in a very weak position, actually, at the moment?
It is in a difficult position. I would not say a weak position, but I would say a difficult one. And that is, as you mentioned, the siege and the unbearable suffering that it causes to the people of the territory. However, there is no doubt that strategically it is in the interest of the entire Palestinian people to have a unified national movement that would be able to speak on their behalf and work, you see, to liberate their land and ensure the restoration of the right of return and all other rights.
And Paul, what's your analysis of Hamas's position? Do you think they are quite weak at the moment?
I think that rather like Mahmoud Abbas, they don't have that many options. The activities under former General Assisi, about to become President Assisi of Egypt, with a statement that says Egypt now controls the Sinai, is really a death knell for the movement of goods, weapons and materiel into Gaza. The tunnels have been closed and in many places destroyed. Hamas attempted a reconciliation of its own with their friends in Tehran. That doesn't seem to have worked terribly well, and would have been, if it had come off, very, very unpopular with the Palestinian street. After all, it's Tehran that's supporting the murdering of Palestinians in Damascus. So Hamas doesn't have that many open options for itself either. What's needed, and I would go back to something that Daniel Ben-Simon said before, is an articulation from Gaza to Israel that says, here are key words: the quartet, reconciliation, recognition of Israel, let's not go too far about Jewish state or not Jewish state, rescinding violence, wanting to be partners in a peace process. If all of those things are articulated, and Mahmoud Abbas has been able to do that very successfully, inviting members of different parts of the Israeli Knesset, as recently as last week, to come and meet with him, why can't Haniyeh do the same thing in Gaza? We hear on Israel radio and television very frequently discussions directly with Palestinians in the occupation, whether in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. I hear it. I know it's on Israel television all the time. We need to hear these kind of key diplomatic semantics very much more overtly from Gaza as the beginning of a process trying to convince Israelis that Hamas is kind of like what the PLO used to be seen as by Israel.
But are you saying that they should recognise the conditions that have been laid down by Israel and Washington and the EU before the end of negotiations, or should they be rather the outcome rather than preconditions?
Well, I think Mahmoud Abbas has said it very clearly himself. I am the guy who will carry out the negotiations. Hamas is going to agree to the things I've already agreed to with Israel. The quartet parameters are things that we agree to. We expect them to agree to it. What more do you want? It doesn't seem to me that regardless of the minefields, that you could expect a great deal more in this context, other than a bit more, as Daniel Ben-Simon was saying, a bit more openness from Gaza, a great deal more accessibility.
Yeah, I think it's not just that Hamas are in a much weaker position, and they certainly are that, because of what's happened in Egypt. All of their supporters, Egypt, Syria, Iran, seem to have abandoned them. But it's much more that Mahmoud Abbas, who was written off only a year or two ago as a very uncharismatic, hopeless politician, has actually emerged as a strong player in the last few months. I mean, he won the recognition at the UN by massive, at 138 to 9. He's now applied to join United Nations bodies, agencies, conventions. He's signed the agreement with Hamas, and he is proving, I think, a more skilled negotiator than Netanyahu, who comes over as transparent, exasperating. I mean, he may be admired by Israeli voters, but I don't know any other group of people who have the same admiration for him. And but at the end of the day, it's about democracy. Palestine is trying to be a democracy. If Israel stands in their way, if Israel doesn't allow Jerusalem Palestinians to vote. If Israel tries to stop Gazans and Gazan MPs coming to the West Bank, or West Bank MPs going to Gaza, he'll just be seen as somebody sabotaging the democratic process. And at the end of the day, if you want peace between Palestine and Israel, the Israelis have to speak to the elected representatives of the Palestinian people. And that at the moment includes both Hamas and Fatah. And it will include, after the next election, whoever the Palestinian voters decide to choose. And it's no point that the Israelis saying, oh, we won't talk to these people. And it's very sad if the Europeans say we won't talk to these people. They should just accept the democratic verdict. Otherwise they undermine everything that they say. Europe is supposed to be in favour of democracy. The Americans are. They completely undermine it in the eyes of Palestinians by then refusing to speak to the elected politicians.
I'd like to give the last word, because we're coming to the end of the time, to Dr. Dawood. I mean, do you see any chance, Dr. Dawood, that the EU particularly, but the United States also, will change the line and become a bit more impartial between Israel and the Palestinians?
In the context of our discussion and the agreement in Gaza, both countries or parties in the international quartet did not openly condemn it. In fact, the Americans, they simply said, we are disappointed. The Europeans welcomed it. They went even further to welcome it. And that is a slight indicator that, there is a recognition that if there ought to be peace in the Palestinian territories, or an agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis, it must include all the major parties. You cannot have an agreement with one party and then you exclude the other, which represents a significant constituency among the Palestinian people. And this is the agenda of Netanyahu and his group and all the Israelis, and this is why it's not working.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Dr. Dawood. We'll have to end this program. And thank you also, Martin Linton and Paul Osiskin. And thank you, of course, at home for watching. Please tune in again for future discussions. And don't forget, you can keep up with the discussion by following us on Twitter at the address below, or by following Islam Channel Current Affairs on Facebook. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.